Hello and welcome to today's ramble around the churchyard. Of course, it's a virtual ramble. We can't meet in person just at the moment, but more news about that a little bit later on towards the end of our ramble today. We are looking today at reconstructing the Georgian St. Nicholas. So we're going to be going back to the 18th century and looking at what the church was like then. My name's Jeff Richards, and I'm one of the trustees of the Friends of St. Nicholas Churchyard. And it is a historic time in which we're living, so it is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, is to go back and spend some time looking at history. Now, before we get going with the rest of the ramble, I'd like to say thank you very much to Enjoy Sutton and Sutton Civic Society, who have been encouraging us in the creation of these little rambles and videos and stories about the development of Sutton. Enjoy Sutton is the forward-facing, it's the consumer-facing side of the business improvement district. It represents 500 businesses in and up and down the high street. Fantastically important part of really making Sutton a great place to live, to shop, to work. And Sutton Civic Society is a group of people who act as a critical friend to the council, trying to make sure that any of the development that takes place in Sutton matches our aspirations for a place that we can be proud to live. So do consider engaging with Enjoy Sutton, and especially Sutton Civic Society as a membership organisation. And I'm going to touch on societal changes, looking at questions of justice as well, because you can't look at the history of Sutton without considering the origin of a lot of its wealth, which is certainly we're transitioning in this session from medieval wealth into which was based on wool and agriculture into now portable trade, and that's going to be all a part of the development of our imperial history and our colonial history, and touching on things like the slave trade. If you're interested in any of those topics, then do look at Sutton College. They've got stacks of history and culture classes, brilliant group of people to be able to take your learning further on these topics. Now, where we left it last week when we were looking at the medieval church, this is more or less the shape of the church that we have, and we have dealt with in previous rambles the medieval church. That took us up to really about 1550, after the Edwardian reforms, when the altars had been smashed out, the medieval cult of saints had ended, and the destruction of the images. And we have this period really until the 17th century where there is essentially a small church servicing a population of maybe 200 people within the village, 250 people, small number of households. It wasn't to grow until 100 households until 1800, and it's because of the ending of the Lord of the Manor being Chertsey, and it becoming the Lord of the Manor was then the Carew family and the successors, tied up with an estate that really most of the action was taking place elsewhere. It was taking place in Beddington. That's where the Lord left. That's where people were. It wasn't until the 17th century, when trade started to develop, that we started to see any hint of change within the church. And our first monument of any importance was added into the church into the early part of the 17th century, and that was the monument of Sarah Glover. And I'll remind you of what her monument looks like in a little bit. But we're talking about really at the start of the Georgian period, 1717, this sleepy church and it had just started to have in its village larger houses coming in. And we know the shape of the church, and this is a diagram of the church from about 1824. You have a sense of when we can see that at this point the tower has been built. Up until then, the steeple had been there. The steeple was replaced with a tower. The tower furnishings, you can see in here that there are stairs in the tower and also by the font, which is in the porch. This, by the way, the orientation is to the east, is on the left. You can see the altar, and the tower is into the west. Then, so north. North is at the top classically. The north is actually at the bottom here, and we've got the south towards the top. So this represents the diagram that we see here, and of course we're in an environment in which the church is rapidly growing. Because the town is rapidly growing. And this is a map. This is Rock's map of the end of the period. It's really in the 1770s, I think it's 1780s. This map is from. You can see some of the places. You can see the size. Sutton is a linear development along the road, and actually roads are the first turnpike. The first Turnpike Act actually dates essentially from William III's reign. So you've got. So that goes back into the beginning of the 18th century. Interestingly, I was reading today that some of the Turnpike Acts which legislated for the roads and the legislation of those roads were only repealed in 2010. There's a certain amount of recent history of statute law still existing until there. But the roads are starting to be improved throughout the 16th century and into the 18th century, throughout the 18th century, roads are steadily being improved, communication is being improved, and and the first carriage service through Sutton to Reigate starts in 1636. So you can see that this is becoming a commutable place for people who have wealth that is derived from trade rather than from agriculture. And we have this building. This is essentially the Georgian church. This is the oldest representation of the Georgian church, just in the 1860s, before it was completely swept away as the church was rebuilt in the new style as it much enlarged. So let's go back into this small village church. We know that it originally had a spire when it was a medieval church. We know that in the end of the 18th century there was moves to have the spire changed into a tower, and we have the coming of the roads and the toll bars and all the changes which are driving population growth. By 1800, you had a population of around 600 people. So it increased from the late 1892s. When Lissons did his survey, he estimated there were 100 households, probably about 400 people, but that had increased by 1801 to 600 people. By 1834 it had more than doubled to over 1,200 people. This is a period of rapid social change. This is when actually we start to get representations of Sutton as a place that people know about because of the journey. Here is a picture by Thomas Rowlandson of the Cock Inn. We still have the image of the Cock, or I think it's been taken away for cleaning at the moment, but the Cock rests at the top of the high street, marking that point within the coaching inn. this is a bar across the road, indicating that this is one of the gates through which you would have to travel on that coaching route. And you had coaching services. There were up to 9 different services going through Sutton on any one day at different times. So that was both up and down transporting goods. So there was a lot of traffic throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century. Back to our small church, we've got the reality of this church growing through the 18th century. It is small. You can see that marked on here there are pews. You can see as well a box area on the top of the diagram in the centre, where it looks like there's another set of stairs. That's actually the set of stairs going up into the pulpit. If you so these are box pews, and you can see as well, if we look to the left-hand side, you can see where the altar is, and you can see monument written there. That monument would be the Brownlow monument, which is a huge monument that dominated it. But the first monument that was in the church of any significance, really, was actually the Sarah Glover monument that we see here. So that's going to be that would have been in the church, and actually the church by the end of the Georgian period, as we came into Victoria's reign, we were finding ourselves crowded with different monuments. Up in the rail, there were the monuments to, like here, Henry Witch, past rector. He was the rector that saw us through the Civil War period. Many of the changes he was. He had gone through the reign of Charles II, through the Protectorate and Cromwell and all that, and into the Restoration. He'd seen big cultural changes as well, where you've got the starting to have people from Africa living in Sutton. So first African mentioned in Sutton is 1677. He was baptised. That was a guy called John Sango, and we see as well the fantastic monument that was the Brownlow monument, and I've told the story of the Lords of the Manor, Richard Mason and his daughters before. This is Dorothy, his daughter. Absolutely wonderful work of gilt and gingerbread, hidden now behind the organ. It was moved into the church. But where we've talked about the idea of the box pews, you have to start to imagine these plain wooden areas. People, each family group would sit in here. There would be services, maybe 2 services a day on a Sunday to be able to accommodate everybody, but essentially people crowded into the church. Not really a space where you would individually go to just contemplate. You might have as you have here, the orientation around the altar, but actually in St. Nicholas, you wouldn't have had this. The walls may well have been painted stark white, and there would have been no stained glass in the windows. It would have just been plain glass. But the walls were covered in these monuments that we have, and I'll talk more about. You can see in this church from London has got the type of raised pew and console where the parish clerk would sit, and also where the minister would then ride up to preach the sermon. So changing from the centre box to the top box when they came to doing the sermon. It's an interesting arrangement to think that our church would have been quite a crowded space with the panels. Some of them were, as we can see here, the charity boards marking out, mostly displayed in the tower, because that was an area that people would go in and be able to see the notices. So the job of these charity boards are to inform every single member of the parish what money had been left for the public good by benefactors. And you can see some of these are dating, like Charles Hatch is mentioned there, with the date 1770, so very much in our Georgian period. And if we in some of the descriptions that we have of the church, and we've got descriptions from gentlemen's magazines and periodicals and almanacs, which talk about the church right in the early 19th century, describing it as a very tidy, very neat church where things are very obviously looked after and cared for. And they describe, in one of the descriptions, they describe the wood of the pulpit being painted to look like wainscoting. So if you imagine the fluted effect of carved woods, well, rather than the fluting actually being there, it was plain panels, but they had been painted to get that impression of designed wood. Now we have the monuments dominating the church. This is obviously very dusty and dirty as it's looking now, because that's hidden away behind the organ in the modern church. But there would have been a tumble of monuments looming over the congregation, anyone coming in. There's the monuments to Isaac Littlebury, the bookseller. There's the Talbot monuments. These are all monuments that had to have a space on the walls. They would have, but the lower part of the walls entirely within the wainscoting and the box pews. Everywhere that could be used for seating was taken, and it was the pressure on seating that started to really to drive some of the changes, wanting to have to be able to move things into replacing the steeple or to change it into a tower. So you can see here a collection being taken in the Church of St. Martin, Ludgate, towards the building of a new steeple on Sutton Church, for which apparently the sum of £600 was required, but only getting 9 shillings and 7 pence. But we have, in that, by the end of the Georgian period, a tower. That happened in the 1790s, so the tower appeared. And we also saw continual work as this population was exploding. So I described it doubling from just in a period of less than 20 years, really, from about 600 people, well, just over 20 years, 1801, estimated at 600 people, and now nearly 1,200. So it was a necessity to keep trying to enlarge the church. That's why you had galleries adding 186 sittings, which is really sort of, this is when the end of the box pews came in. So these would have been free seating. It would not have been it wouldn't have been anything other than anyone could sit anywhere, rather than having reserved seating, which was the box pews idea. So this would be free and unappropriated forever, and are in addition to the 151 formerly provided. So this is adding in more and more seatings into the church, doubling the number of people that could do that. And again, wanting to be able to add vestry space, because if you're doing more and more work within the church, you want to take the space that was formerly used for the priest to get dressed, or where you were needed to sign registers and store things, you needed to add in a vestry on the south side of the church, and so that was finished in 1828. Some of the plans for the church just never could take off. You had considerations this was a putative plan in the 1830s. Really, you're trying to, the church wardens were really trying to get more and more seating into the church, ever more crowded. I think to anyone from a modern perspective going into a church that was like that, it would have it would be a frightening thing from a fire inspection and fire safety perspective. If you think of, say, Nicholas Church now, with its seating in an event like Sutton Soup, would take 220 people and feel very, very crowded to us. But imagine a church essentially about half the size, having 160 people on the ground floor and then 180 on the gallery above. It would have been a phenomenally crowded mass of humanity and totally needing to be restructured and rebuilt. And that's what we did. We saw a church much enlarged. We have a sense of the footprint. We know that it is that the West End remained the same, and so it grew outwards to the east. And we've got probably a sense of where Henry Witch's grave is, which is more or less where the high altar would have been inside the church. So next time you're inside, have a think about the sizings of the church. Have a look at the. I think I gave the measurements of the medieval church in the last Ramble, but we have now our very, very modern church sitting in a completely changed environment. I always think that it's a very strange thing because the early illustrations of the church show it devoid of vegetation, but now we are surrounded by trees and shrubs, but within an island of green, surrounded by the high-rise buildings and urban development of Sutton. This lecture, or ramble I should say, is going to be up on the YouTube channel, so please do look at the other YouTube videos that we've got there. So I hope you're going to be able to find that and enjoy that. Lots to explore there. I think we're now on to about the 16th ramble. If I've hit topics that you're interested in, then please do go to Sutton College, suttoncollege.ac.uk. You can look at their history and culture classes, take these ideas further. They know their stuff. So I hope you're going to be able to join me for next week's ramble. We'll play it by ear. I've got to do some risk assessments, but I am hoping that we'll be able to make some sort of announcement next week about returning to actual explorations of the churchyard, but in small groups. We've got the rules really are in groups of no more than 6 people from mixed households, socially distanced. So we'll look at the risk assessments, and I watch out for an announcement during the week. But thank you very much. So long, Sutton. Your history.